Hello everyone and welcome back. This section is about getting you familiar with the Protocol-Delegate pattern. It's used everywhere in UIKit. It's a core pattern in Mac and iOS development, and by learning it, you will not only gain a handy pattern for receiving events in an uncoupled way from other components, it will enable you to write really higher quality, more maintainable code. So let's jump in and see how it works. So the problem the Protocol-Delegate pattern is solving is one of communication. How do we find classes that can communicate back to other classes without knowing anything about them? Well, it works like this. First, we create a class or struct that wants to communicate to the outside world. Then it defines a protocol. This is the protocol it's going to use to broadcast events and inform the world that, hey, interesting things are going on. Anyone interested in receiving those events then implements that protocol. They can register themselves as a delegate, which the original class can communicate back to, and that gives it basically the means to communicate back. By basically sending messages and interesting events, the original class can communicate back to a delegate without knowing anything about it. The beauty of this pattern is it does a couple of things. One, it reduces coupling between classes. Classes no longer have to have intimate details about one another. They can simply communicate through protocols. Two, it does a really good job of separating responsibility. The responsibility between generating an event and reacting to it is now completely separate. And thirdly, it's just a simple, clean, easy to understand pattern once you know how it works and see what's going on. Don't get me wrong, this can be a confusing pattern at first, but once you see it in action, it's a really beautiful pattern that you're going to want to use in a lot of your designs of your applications. So without further ado, let's head over to the arcade and see how this pattern works in action. Hello everyone and welcome back. In this episode of the arcade, we're going to add two protocol delegates. One to our text field here, so that when we type in the name of a city, we can fetch that city from the text field and update our weather. And two, when we click the location manager, we're also going to update our weather based on where we are. We're going to do it with the Protocol-Delegate pattern because that's how these two controls in UIKit are built. And then later on, you're going to write your own Protocol-Delegate pattern, one that actually goes out and fetches the weather. But let's start with the text field. Let's go back to our weather view controller and let's just click on this UI text field by going Control Command click and moving into the UI text field class. Once in here, let's go Command F and let's do a search in this definition for the word delegate. And look what we find. Something called the UITextFieldDelegate. And this is our protocol delegate. If we Control click Command on that again, we can see how the UI text field defines a protocol explaining how it's going to communicate back to us in our view controller. And it's going to do it by using methods like this. Here we can detect when the text field should end, when it should begin editing. We have the means of extracting text from within it. So let's go ahead and use this in our view controller and see how we can get that city from the text field. Once in here, let's go Command F and let's do a search in this definition for the word delegate. And look what we find. Something called the UITextFieldDelegate. And this is our protocol delegate. If we Control click Command on that again, we can see how the UI text field defines a protocol explaining how it's going to communicate back to us in our view controller. And it's going to do it by using methods like this. Here we can detect when the text field should end, when it should begin editing. We have the means of extracting text from within it. So let's go ahead and use this in our view controller and see how we can get that city from the text field. Let's head back to our view controller. I'm going to do it by going Control Command back arrow, back arrow. And what we need to do here is we're basically the delegate for the UI text field. We need to basically implement that protocol so it can communicate with us. And the way we typically do that in Swift is we come down here and we do it via an extension. I'm just going to copy in some code and then we'll walk through it here. A couple things to note. One is I'm going to put this comment here called mark followed by UITextFieldDelegate. Basically, this is a marker interface that I can use within my class to help document how my view controller works. So if I go Control-6, I can bring down a shortcut key here, and you'll see a little mark at the top here, UITextFieldDelegate. This is where we're going to put all of the functions related to the UITextFieldDelegate. So if I quickly want to come in here and see what I need to do to work with the text field, I'll have them all in one place. And by us implementing this protocol, we're basically saying we are ready to receive messages from the text field to do all of these neat things. For example, if we option click here, we can see what the protocol delegate thinks should happen when the return button is pressed. Or when it thinks it's about to finish editing, we can decide ourselves what would we like to do when we've finished editing text in that text field. In this case, if the text is blank, we're just going to return true. But if it's not, we're going to clear out the text, put in some placeholder text called type something, and then return false. And when we are finished editing, we can actually grab the text or the city from the text field, use it to fetch the weather from our to-be-created weather service, and then clear out the text field. One neat convention you'll often see in UIKit's implementation of the protocol delegate pattern is quite often it will pass itself back, the component generating the call, as part of the delegate pattern itself. So in the case of text field, here we're getting back the actual text field used to generate this callback and passing it back in. Here we already have a reference to it, and we're just calling end editing on the very own reference that we have. But down here, you can see how we can use the text field that was passed back to us, set the text on it, or put some placeholder text in there also. Either way is fine. These are the same text field. I'm just calling those out if you get a little confused around which one is being used. Both work, and either one is acceptable. Now you may have noticed there's one function we haven't mentioned yet, search pressed. This isn't actually part of the UITextFieldDelegate. This is the function that's going to get called as part of the target action on our search button when someone clicks this. But we haven't hooked that up yet, so let's go do that now. Let's scroll back up to the top here. Let's find the search button, and let's add a target action here to ourself, meaning when someone clicks that button, execute the search pressed and basically dismiss the keyboard. In other words, go ahead and do the search. So if we run this now and someone types something in here and we hit search, that keyboard disappears. Okay, that's great. But if you notice, if we go set some breakpoints in here, for example, on text field should return, in other words, what should happen when return is pressed here after typing a city, well, notice that things don't quite work. For example, if I type the word City of Calgary here and I hit return, our breakpoint isn't executing. What about should end editing? And what about did end editing? As I'm typing different text in here and I'm trying out different cities, I notice that those methods aren't getting executed or called. Any idea why? And the reason is because we forgot to do what is probably the number one thing when working with Protocol Delegate. We forgot to register or set ourselves up for the delegate so we can receive these calls. This will happen to you countless times, and I always forget about it. So let me show you what I mean. Before we can receive these messages, we've got to register ourselves as the delegate and basically say, you can go ahead and call us. Let's add another method here. At the very top in View.Load, let's call this setup. And this is where we're going to do some basic setup for our view controller when things get going. We'll create a new function here called setup. And in there, this is where we'll do our registration to be called when something happens on these protocol delegates. So in our case, what we need to do is go search text field, that delegate, we need to pass ourselves in as a reference so it can call back to us. When we forget this line, none of the protocol delegate stuff works. It's really, really important. It's easy to forget. But now if we run this, and now if we go in there and we start typing some text like New York, and we hit enter, our breakpoints do get called. We are hooked up, and we are in fact getting the proper callbacks from the text field to us. But it's easy to forget if you don't set yourself up as the delegate, which I happened to do the first time we went through this. Okay, well, there you have it. An example of Protocol Delegate used in UIKit. Let's do the same thing again. This time, let's do it for something called a core location manager. This is a class which when we click this button or when the simulator starts up, it's going to request from our app permission to basically figure out where we are in the world and then use that location to fetch the weather for us. It uses a library called core location. So in order to get it to work, we need to import this new core location library. With that then, we can create a protocol delegate instance of something called a location manager. This is the class which is actually going to do the work of figuring out what our location is for us. So this is interesting to note. Protocol Delegate isn't just for UI classes. You can use them on manager classes that do work for you too. In the case of location manager, if we control command click into there and search again for the word delegate, we'll see it too has a protocol that it uses to define all the different things that the location manager delegate can do. And it can do a lot of different things. It can figure out your locations, it can update headings. We fortunately only needed to do a couple of things for us. One is basically tell us where we are, and two, notify us if there is an error. But we're going to implement it in exactly the same way. We're going to scroll down to the bottom of our view controller. We're going to create an extension on our view controller for the protocol that we want to implement, in this case, CL Location Manager Delegate, and it's here that we're going to implement the methods that we're interested in. Specifically, we're going to hook into this one called did update locations, where here we can get from the list of locations the longitude and latitude of where we actually are in the world, and we can pass that to our to be created weather service, which will eventually fetch the weather. Likewise, they've got a callback here, did fail with error. In the event that something goes wrong, we can print an error and hopefully diagnose and see what didn't happen. And just like with the search button, we need to hook up the location press button so we can receive a target action and actually trigger the location manager to go ahead and request our location. So just like with the search button, let's go back up to location button. Let's add a target action there. And this is what's going to get called when someone hits our location button here. Again, this is just typical target action stuff. We're passing ourselves as the receiver of the target. This is the function or action that's going to get invoked when they press that button. And if we go into location pressed, this is where we're going to ask our location manager, hey, can you just go out there and request a location for us? And look how it's going to talk back to us through the protocol delegate. It's going to basically give us a location which we can figure out and fetch the weather. Now, of course, this isn't going to work until we actually set ourselves up as the delegate. So let's go and do that now in that setup method we created before. So just like with the text field, we need to register ourselves as a delegate for the location manager. So we'll delegate, we'll pass ourselves in as a reference. And in our case, there's just two more things we're going to do as part of using the location manager. One, we need to request permission from the app or the user to basically give us permission to request the location on the phone. And then secondly, we'll actually trigger a location so that as soon as the app starts up, it can request where we are. All right, let's fire up the app now and see what happens. Command R, here we go. Now, I'm not expecting it to actually update the weather because we haven't actually done that yet. But when I run the app and I look in the debug console here, I do see something interesting. There is a message down here. And it basically says this app is trying to access private information without having an entry in the plist file explaining what we're trying to do. So basically, this is Xcode being really handy. It's saying that before the location manager is going to work, we need to request permission from the user, enable for them to allow us to determine their location. And this is the key we need to use to do it. So I'm going to copy this key, NS location when in usage description. I'm going to go Command C. Let's go into our info plist and let's add an entry in there. And I'm just going to copy and paste that key in. I'm going to go Command V, Now this is interesting. I've copied in the key. Watch what happens when I press return. Xcode is super smart. It translated that into a more English readable description, privacy, location, when in use, uses description. And now I just need to type in a message that we're going to display to the user when we request access to their location. So in this case, I'm just going to type something like location needed to fetch local weather, period. I'm going to hit return there. I'm going to run the application again. And now when the simulator starts up, voila, it's actually asking the user, do you really want to allow this app to have access to your location? They can either deny, allow once, or allow when the app is in usage. But now we've got their permission. Now we can request the information. And now we know we've fully hooked up to the CL location manager using the protocol delegate. Okay, well, there you have it. 2 examples of how protocol delegate is used in UIKit and how we can use it when building applications. It's used all over the place, really, really common, really good for you to know. And I apologize if I went through that a bit quickly. What I really want to get into is the interesting stuff, which is having you create your own protocol delegate, and together we're going to use one to actually fetch the weather. So come back, and in the next episode, we're going to create a weather service, implement protocol delegate on it, and we'll really get a solid understanding of the mechanics and ultimately be able to fetch, eventually, some real weather. So coming back, we'll create our own protocol delegate, and we'll see you then. Hey everybody, welcome back. Just to quickly recap where we are, we've now added the protocol delegate 2 times to our application. We've done it here for the text field. When someone types in here, we can now enter a city like Calgary. We can do search, and it's the protocol delegate behind the scenes, which is going to get us the city. And we've also added it for our location button here. Now when we hit location, protocol delegate will run, and we will get the city also through that. In this episode, we're going to use protocol delegate not for UIKit controls, but for our very own. We're going to create our own weather service, add a protocol delegate to it, and see what it's like to actually use protocol delegate in your own basic programming. So without further ado, let's jump in and use the protocol delegate to create our own weather service. Okay, first we're going to do just a little bit of organizing because I'd like us to start separating our concerns a bit into models, views, and controllers. So I'm going to go over here into our project, and I'm just going to start creating a few groups without folders. These are virtual folders. They're not actually going to be created on disk, but they're handy for grouping things within our Xcode project. So the first one we're going to create here is called model. And this is where eventually we're going to stick some models. And then I'm going to create another one called view. And finally, another one called controller. Now I can already tell when I created the view, I created it. Now I can already tell when I created the view, I actually created it as an actual physical directory. And you can see the difference between the two. A real folder will be completely plush like this, whereas a virtual folder will have a little bit of a icon in the lower left-hand corner there. So I'm just going to delete this one, and I'm going to recreate the view more carefully this time. New group. See, it sometimes changes. Sometimes it's with folder, sometimes without. I'm just going to go new group here. That's the one I want. And I'm going to call it view like that and stick it just like this. There we go. Now I'm going to stick my weather view controller in here. We don't have any views yet. Actually, that's not true. We do have a view. It's just embedded in our view controller. And in an upcoming episode, I'm going to show you how to extract views from your view controllers so you can more programmatically work them. And we'll stick them in the views. And model we don't have yet, but we're going to be creating one shortly. So we're just going to leave it just like that. Okay, so now we're ready to create our weather service. And I'm going to stick this in this model folder we just created here. So I'm going to go Command N. We're going to create a brand new Swift file. This one's going to be called weather service. And this is going to be the class which is ultimately going to go out there and fetch our weather for us. Now we're going to create this just as a plain old struct, weather service. And in here, we've already kind of stubbed out what we would like this class to do. If we go back and look at the weather view controller, somewhere in here, we commented out an actual call to the weather service that we would like to have. In this case, we called it fetch weather, given a city name, passing in the city. So why don't we go with that? We'll create a new function on our weather service called fetch weather, and we will give it the parameter name of city name. That will be a string, and it is in here that we will eventually go out and fetch the weather doing an HTTP GET request with a URL session, which we're going to do in an upcoming episode. But for now, we're just going to fake it. We're just going to pretend we've got the data. We're just going to return it as a part of our protocol delegate, and we'll do the real loading of it later. Now watch carefully, because this is where protocol delegate is different. Instead of just returning some weather object that we could create just like this in a function, we're actually going to have a delegate do that work for us. And we're going to have some kind of function that returns it. And this is what makes protocol delegate a little bit different. Let me show you what I mean. First, let's create that structure, which is going to represent the weather, which we ultimately like to use to populate our view. Now, if we look at our view, I can see that we're going to need something to indicate what kind of image to show up here, some kind of temperature, and finally, maybe the city name. So let's just create a weather structure just to represent the data that we need to put into our view. So let's create a struct here called weather. Whoops. Struct called weather. And let's give it just a few attributes. Let's give it a city name, which is going to be a string. And let's also give it a temperature, which for now I'm just going to say is a double. I'm also not sure how we're going to handle deciding what image to show here on how it's tied to the weather, but we'll deal with that later. We'll just hard code it for now. But with this structure now, we've got something that we can actually pass around that encapsulates the data. Now we just need a way of returning some weather from our fetch method here when the call actually happens. Now here we go. Let's do the protocol delegate. First step is going to be defining our protocol. So let's come in here and let's define a protocol called weather service delegate. And this is going to be of type any object. And it's in here that we're actually going to define the protocol or the interface that anyone who likes to get an update can get that from us via these functions. So in our case, we're going to create a function called didFetchWeather. And in there, it is going to, I'm going to follow the conventional protocol delegate pattern. I'm going to make the naming of this first parameter not required. So I'm just going to put an underscore there. I'm going to return ourselves as an instance, the actual weather service that we're a part of here. And I'm also going to return the actual weather that we have fetched, just like that. So that's simply going to define the protocol. That's all we need for now. And when someone is interested in getting notified, we're going to call this method on them, passing back the weather. Now, of course, how are we going to do that? We're just going to fake it for now. I'm going to create a new weather object here from our struct, and I'm just going to give it some different names so we know that this is actually being passed back as part of the protocol and something different. So let's go to a very different city. Let's go to Hong Kong. And let's say it's a hot day in Hong Kong. And let's make the temperature 33 degrees. Whew, pretty hot. So we've got the weather, but we need a way of passing it back to the delegate or someone who's interested in it, receiving it. This is where we define our delegate. We can come in here and define a var called delegate. And the convention here is to make this optional. Because remember, we don't know who's going to be registering themselves as us. They certainly won't be there probably when we create the weather service structure. So this is going to be an optional thing that just like UI table UI text field and others, they're going to set that after from the view controller. That's how they're going to register themselves with us, is through this delegate here. So we'll define it just like that. And when we've got the weather, again, we're going to hard code this for now. We're just going to go delegate dot. And if they do implement our protocol, we're just going to pass back the weather here. So we're just going to pass back ourselves. We'll pass back the weather object we created. And voila, that's how they're going to get it back into our view controller. So let's go back to our view controller now, find that line that we commented out and comment it in and see if we just can't get this to run. Okay, first of all, we're going to need a weather service. So let's go instantiate that at the top. Let's go here and create we're going to have to make this a var because we're going to need to add ourselves as a delegate to it. So let's go weather service is equal to weather service. There is an instance of our weather service. And what's the one thing we always need to do when doing protocol delegate, which we always forget? We need to set ourselves up as the delegate. So here we go, weather service dot delegate. And what are we going to set that equal to? Ourselves. This is just us. We want to be called when the weather service gets the weather. And the way we register ourselves is by setting ourselves up as this. Now look what it's saying here. You can't be a weather service because you don't support the weather service delegate protocol. And it's even offering to fix it for us here. Now we could, but I'm just going to come down here and just like we did with the other ones, I'm going to define this via an extension. So right at the bottom, just like we did before, I'm going to put a nice little mark here, weather service delegate in this case. We could also call it manager if we like. I'm just going to call it weather service. And via the extension, we're going to implement the weather service delegate protocol. I'm going to come down here and close it. And watch this, Xcode is going to be very nice. It's going to give me the same error message, but now I'm happy to have it add in the protocol stubs. We'll let it do that. And it knows what we need to do. And now, once we get the weather, we can update our UI. And in this case, there's two methods that we can call, or two properties we can set to set the new weather in our UI. We can take our temperature label and just like we did before, call that same function to set our attributed text. And there's two elements of our UI that we'd like to update here. One is we'd like to update our temperature label. We're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to set the attributed text by calling that make temperature text with our weather that we get passed. We'll take the temperature here. And also we can set the city label. We already know what city it is, so this is kind of redundant to set it again, but for consistency, let's just take the weather pass back. Maybe there's a slight change in formatting or something, and we'll set that equal to our weather city name. Now we've got a slight problem here. Make temperature wants this to be a string, I believe, the temperature. So we could convert it into a string and pass it in, but there's something else we can do, which I wanted to show you. We can use what's called a computed property here to take the double form of our temperature and convert it more elegantly into a string. So here temperature is a double. This is just how we're representing it in our data model. And we can convert it to a temperature string just by providing this convenience routine. This is a computed property. It doesn't actually store anything. It just takes existing stored properties we have, does some computations for us, or in this case formatting, and we're just going to convert that into a string just like this. So now if we come back, I can use the temperature string here, and that should make the UI happy, and we should be hopefully good to go. Now just before we run this, let's set some breakpoints just to see sort of the sequencing of things that's going to go on here. We're going to do a search, and then we'd like to see a call to the weather service to basically say fetch the weather. No, we're not getting the weather right here. This is going to come back to us via the Protocol-Delegate pattern later. Let's now scroll down here where we actually implement the Protocol-Delegate. And let's just set a breakpoint here to verify that we get it back. And once we do, we can then use that to update the UI and see how we can, just what the chain of events is in terms of how the Protocol-Delegate's called. Okay, so let's run this. There's our simulator. Let's type in Hong Kong here. I'm going to hit enter. And here we go. In text field did end editing, we're about to call our weather service. And if we just check out some values here, we should see that our city is indeed Hong Kong. I'm going to let this go. We've now called the weather service. We've got the weather hard-coded to Hong Kong. We've called it back, and we're getting called back by this Protocol-Delegate. So we can check for the contents of the weather here. Let's just print out the weather object. Oh, not weather service. I'm going to print out the weather object. And there we go. It is Hong Kong, 33 degrees. So if we just let this go, our UI should update, and voila, there we go. Protocol-Delegate in action, something we built ourselves, populating our UI. Good stuff, everyone. For those of you who didn't see it, let's just walk it one more time in slow motion. We defined a weather service that had a method called fetchWeather, and it was going to communicate back to us via a delegate. In order to do that, it needed to do two things. One, it had to define a protocol called didFetchWeather, which we can implement in our view controller. And secondly, we had to register ourselves as the callback or the delegate for the protocol. That way, when fetchWeather service runs, it has an instance or a reference to us via the delegate, and it can then pass us the weather via the didFetchWeather method, and we are free then to update the UI. It's a really powerful pattern because in the next stage, we're actually going to make this network call. It's going to happen on a separate thread, and we like that to occur asynchronously. So we don't have to sit here and block. It can all happen magically behind the scenes. And the Protocol-Delegate is the pattern that makes it happen. All right, great stuff, everyone. Good for you for hanging in there. We've now got a Protocol-Delegate hooked up and getting us, albeit some fake weather, and populating our UI. We've done all the heavy lifting we need to do here. Next, we're going to go more to the back end and actually implement the HTTP service call, which is going to fetch that weather for us. And you'll see how we can use the NSURL session to actually fetch data, return it, and also parse JSON and do some great decoding. Okay, can't wait to do it with you. I'll see you in the next section.